Hey everyone, Travis Bowman here. So I picked up this used Street Fighter 2 arcade one-up machine via Facebook Marketplace a few months ago, and I got it for more than a decent price, so I decided I was going to try to mod it. I found a video tutorial on a really cool but simple modification from a YouTuber called ETAPrime. His videos are super high quality and extremely precise and to the point, and this mod looked pretty fun to do and very easy to follow, so after finally finding a cabinet for a decent price, I decided to go for it. Just a quick heads up, we are going to be talking about this mod and whether or not it was worth it to do. However, this is not a video tutorial to do this mod yourself, and I highly suggest you do what I did and check out ETAPrime if you want to do this yourself. But before you do that, you should probably stick around until the end of this video because I'm going to talk about the aftermath of this mod and address a few important things that ETAPrime did not on his original video. You'll definitely want to take that into consideration before committing to this mod yourself. So, before we actually get into the mod, let's briefly talk about the stock cabinet and why we would want to modify it in the first place. So the big selling point of these smaller arcade cabinets is very obvious: space. They take up considerably less space than a full-size legitimate cabinet. There are a ton of different arcade one-up cabinets out there based on a wide variety of different styles of arcade games, including those with just a few buttons and a trackball, to more specific types, including ones that involve light guns and steering wheels. In this specific video, we're talking about the Street Fighter 2 cabinet, which has 6 action buttons and a joystick per player. This version is widely regarded as the best candidate for modding, as it covers the widest variety of games that will be compatible with that specific button configuration. So despite arcade one-up cabinets selling very well, you might be very surprised to find a plethora of these things selling secondhand on the Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist, and elsewhere. These sell for hundreds of dollars less than what a legit full-size cabinet would cost, and are fairly easy to assemble out of the box, and once assembled you just plug in the power cable and play. So why are people selling these off? I can think of 3 different reasons, and as I list those, you'll probably start to see why people end up modding these things. Reason number 1, buyer's remorse. They took them home, put them together, and played them for a little while, and realized, damn, how often am I really going to be using this thing? Yeah, I mean, it's cool and it doesn't take up that much space, but it still does take up space. And I could probably use the hundreds of dollars I spent on this on something else that I would actually get a lot of use out of. Yeah, I think most people realize that, and in turn, tried to get as much of their money back as quickly as possible. Reason number 2, boredom. These arcade one-ups have just a couple of games installed. And for this particular cabinet, it's only 3 different versions of the same game, Street Fighter 2. And these are the arcade versions of these games, mind you. There's no option for selecting difficulty level. These games are very challenging, and of course they are. They're designed to be that way, so they can collect as many quarters as possible. And I think people realize that they just couldn't justify the cash and the space for just 3 versions of the same game. And to be perfectly honest, I would not have bought this thing if I knew I was only ever going to keep it stock. Reason number 3, quality, and that's the big one, I think. These cabinets are made with the cheapest of the cheap when it comes to parts. The buttons get very sticky and they don't respond, they don't register inputs, and they can even break. I mean, they're made of very brittle plastic. When I first got this unit, the second player joystick would not register a down input no matter what I did. A buddy of mine came over to check it out, and I couldn't throw any Hadoukens at him at all. I mean, imagine spending all that money on a cabinet that will crap out on you and make the game basically unplayable. This is by far the biggest issue with the arcade one-up machines. I mean, luckily, the stock hardware is very easy to get rid of and replace. And I can personally attest to all of these reasons firsthand, so let's talk about when I got this thing. I was browsing the Facebook Marketplace and came across this used cabinet for substantially less than what they sell for brand new, and it was a perfectly working unit, but the control board was a bit beat up. After haggling for a little bit, the lady that was selling it agreed to meet up with me, and I bought it off of her. So when I was putting it in my car, I asked her why she was selling it, just out of curiosity, and she said that she bought it brand new for her kids, and they got bored with it, and it just ended up collecting dust. Just a quick side note, if you take a look, you'll find some custom artwork, or should I say etching, above the second player controls on this particular unit. It seems like one of the kids carved the word loser into the board, and some people will probably be frustrated by that, but to be honest, I think it adds a bit of charm and maybe even some authenticity to the cabinet. I guess it makes it feel more like the real deal. Okay, so let's talk about how ETAPrime's mod can help us expunge all of the cons about this thing that I talked about earlier. Well, if we can mod the cabinet to get a lot more out of it without spending an arm and a leg, then that should take care of that buyer's remorse. I mean, imagine looking forward to spending some time with this instead of wishing you just hadn't bought it in the first place. And plus, if you do this modification yourself, there's a certain sense of pride and accomplishment you'll feel once you complete it. I mean, it feels good to make things better, don't you think? And what if this cabinet was capable of playing more than 3 versions of the same game? Maybe even games that aren't arcade games, like console games. Wouldn't it be cool to play the console version of Street Fighter 2 on this cabinet, lower the difficulty a bit, and practice up so eventually you can beat the arcade version? Well, that takes care of the boredom, and that's just one example of what we can do after we unlock the ability to add more games. If you're a habitual tinkerer like me, then this will be especially appealing to you. And finally, what if we replaced the god-awful cheap hardware inside this cabinet with something that was actually pretty decent, but still doesn't go outside of our modest budget? If the hardware is at least playable, then wouldn't it be worth it? Well, that's exactly what I thought. So I followed the tutorial, and I did it myself. So let's take a look at what's possible with this cabinet now that it's been modded. Well, instead of being locked to playing Street Fighter 2, we can actually check out some Street Fighter Alpha 3. Now, this is my preferred version of Street Fighter, and it runs beautifully on this cabinet. And let me tell you, having the buttons not stick all the time and having a joystick that actually registers every input makes this cabinet 10 times better than it once was. Okay, so how about something that isn't a fighting game? I've also been getting into this ping pong game quite a bit. The character sprites are genuinely hilarious, and it's a lot of fun to try to beat as many opponents as you can. I mean, this is another example of many different styles of arcade games out there that aren't just one-on-one fighters, and this game is called Speed Spin. Having 6 buttons available is great for pretty much every fighting game that you can imagine. Here's a fun one that I first played on the Sega Genesis back in the 90s, and this is the first time I've actually checked it out on the arcade, and it's called Time Killers. It's exactly what it sounds like, characters from different historical periods kind of fighting it out. If you think Mortal Kombat is bloody, then you gotta check this one out. One of my favorite types of games are beat-em-ups, and on this cabinet I can finally play the arcade version of Capcom's Knights of the Round in a somewhat, sorta, kinda real arcade setting. The music is great, gameplay's super solid, and this is a great one for having a friend over as well. Another great game for 2 players is Cadillacs and Dinosaurs. These Capcom beat-em-ups are some of the craziest and yet best playing beat-em-ups out there. The main reason I got this cabinet was to check out some arcade exclusive games using the arcade controls. And yeah, you could always just emulate these games on your PC, but it's pretty cool to play with an actual quote-unquote arcade cabinet, even if it's just this arcade 1-up cabinet here. It's also kinda neat to check out some of the PC Engine games that were first released in the arcade. Splatterhouse is a classic. I also really dig a game called Ninja Spirit. It plays a lot like the PC Engine port, but I think I prefer the PC Engine version due to the differences in difficulty and options. And also, those PC Engine sound effects are obviously not going to be in the arcade version, but that's kind of a deal breaker for me. The PC Engine sound effects are awesome. So the Neo Geo only had 4 arcade buttons, and since we've got 6, we can definitely check out some of those Neo Geo arcade games as well. Windjammers is a personal favorite of mine, and playing this game with an arcade stick is definitely the way to go. So instead of dropping thousands of dollars on the elusive Neo Turf Masters, you can get your relaxing golfing game fix with this modded cabinet instead. I started this game up when my buddy came over and he said, "Seriously? If you've played this game before, then you probably understand. I have absolutely no interest in golf whatsoever, but it doesn't matter because this game is just different. It pulls you in and doesn't let you go. Talk about a game with charm. I'll fire this game up just for the music alone. It's breathtakingly relaxing." Let's talk about a few things that ETAPrime didn't address in his original video. Now, the first thing is the Raspberry Pi that's used to emulate all of these new games that we just went over. At the time of this video, there seems to be a worldwide chip shortage, and most everything is being affected by that. The Raspberry Pi is a small computer that can be used for a multitude of different things. In this case, we're just using it to run a program called Retropie. Now, this is an interface that's going to allow us to select and play games on a number of different emulators, and it's basically the heart of our entire setup, and it's what allows us to play these games on this cabinet. At the time that ETAPrime did his original video, these things were super cheap, around $35, depending on which model that you wanted. And after doing a lot of research, if I was going to grab the same model of Raspberry Pi that he did in that video, it would cost me around 150 bucks. Now that's a huge difference in cost and could be the deciding factor for most people that are considering this modification. It was a really big disappointment for me. I was really trying to make this work while spending the least amount of money possible. So did I end up biting the bullet and eating that $150 price tag? No. I traded some things that I no longer use with a work buddy of mine, so I got lucky. To be honest, if I hadn't been able to trade for that Raspberry Pi, I probably just would have cut my losses and sold the damn thing altogether, but I'm really glad it didn't work out that way. The second issue has to be with the double-sided tape that he used to mount everything. This is a great idea, but I haven't had much luck with it myself. In order to send the audio from the Raspberry Pi to the stock speaker on your cabinet, you're going to have to use an amp. Now, these are super cheap, but they're not exactly weightless. It may be the brand of double-sided tape that I used, but I can't seem to get anything to stick permanently. I mean, it keeps falling off. Luckily, nothing got yanked out of any ports or anything, but still, it's kind of a mess back here, and it's definitely no longer the most secure setup, and this could have potentially screwed something up pretty badly. My only other solution will be to mount this stuff in some other way, which will almost guarantee some extra drilling in the cabinet. I'd be very interested to know some of your ideas on how to better secure all these components. Now, the third issue is going to be the amp itself. Well, I mean, there's nothing wrong with the amp, and I'm sure whatever amp you decide to buy is going to function just fine. I'm not talking about it functioning, I'm talking about using these practically. Now, most of these amps have knobs that allow you to control, the treble and the bass, and in some cases the mid-range as well. But the most useful knob is obviously going to be the volume control, which is something that ETAPrime did not address directly. This volume control is going to be very important on this cabinet, considering that every arcade game is going to be outputting a different volume level. Now, this is something that most people might not even think about. Okay, so we've got a volume control to fix that, right? Problem solved? Well, kinda. But what we aren't considering is the fact that the way it's mounted, we're going to have to get out of our seat, reach behind the cabinet to adjust the volume every now and then. And I've seen solutions to this already. Some people actually drill more holes in the cabinet to have these knobs kind of sticking out of the front, which is going to be a lot easier to access. But if we're going to drill holes and put these controls on the front of the cabinet, then we're almost guaranteed to have to extend that stock speaker wire. Now, this is probably a really small complaint considering that the original cabinet only had 2 levels of volume, which was loud and very loud, but nevertheless, it's something you might want to consider before jumping into this modification if you've got roommates or, other people in your house that might not appreciate a very loud cabinet. The fourth issue deals with adding games to the Pi. So most people will get a large micro SD card and just add every single game that they possibly can all at once, but if you don't want to dedicate a card with a ton of space or just want to be more frugal with, say, a 16 or 32 gigabyte card, then you'll have to pick and choose a bit more as far as which games you want. This is kind of an issue that I'm currently dealing with. Yeah, some Raspberry Pis have Wi-Fi built in, some don't. Once you put the software on the Pi, you can no longer just kind of plug it into your PC and drag and drop games on it. It doesn't really work like that. ETAPrime has a tutorial that I followed regarding an Ethernet connection. So basically, you'll want to connect both your PC and your Pi to the same router via Ethernet, and then you can drag and drop games onto the Pi. It's an extra step, but to be honest, for my setup, it's actually not that bad, but this might be an issue for you though. It's something to consider. This arcade cabinet is small, but it's still kinda heavy, and it isn't the easiest thing to move around, and sometimes these Raspberry Pis can be finicky, and if you want to add games after the fact, you might need to completely remove the Pi from the cabinet and take it somewhere else inside your home, and this might screw up the controls that you mount for each player. This is definitely something to consider before modding the cabinet. Where in your house are you going to set this thing up? If it's close to your router, then you're probably going to be fine, but if it's on the other side of your house or upstairs, downstairs, you might want to consider setting the Pi up with all of the emulators and games you could possibly want before setting up the controls and putting your cabinet in its final destination inside your house. So here's the big question, is it worth it to do? Well, this is probably going to vary from person to person, but I can tell you my opinion on it. I actually really love this thing now that it's modded, and whenever I have friends over, it's super fun to beat the crap out of each other on some fighting games or just chill and try to get into some beat 'em ups or platformers together. But you have to understand that if you have a Raspberry Pi, you can play all these games connected to your TV if you want. You just need a few USB controllers. I mean, you can even use a few USB arcade sticks and you'll probably get the same vibe. The arcade 1-up cabinet is just an aesthetic. I mean, in my opinion, these things were always just a novelty, but some people actually collect arcade 1-ups in their house and they don't ever mod them. But that's definitely not the mindset that I'm in. I just wanted to do this because it looked like a lot of fun and it's a cool little thing to add to your game room. Another factor to consider is the size of the cabinet. It's pretty small. If you've got two grown men sitting at this thing, it can be kind of cramped. I mean, does it work? Yeah, absolutely. But after an hour or so, it can get a little uncomfortable. My cabinet unfortunately did not come with the riser. Now this is a chunk of wood that Arcade 1-Up sells either bundled with the cabinet or separately. But like most everything else, it's not going to be cheap. And they're nearly impossible to find secondhand because everyone that has an Arcade 1-Up riser wants to bundle it with their cabinet, and that's whether they're planning on selling it or just keeping it. There are a couple tutorials out there that show you how to make your own, but to be honest, 1 extra foot of height is not that much. I'm 6'3", and I've played some demo units that have had the riser attached, and you know, I'll imagine I'll still need to probably get a stool to be comfortable, and that might be fine for some people, but for others that's just more money to spend on what was supposed to be considered a novelty, right? So here's your deciding factor. What would you rather have? A Pi connected to your HD TV or have a mini arcade setup like this? If you just grab a Raspberry Pi and connect it to your living room, then you'll save a lot of money and you'll probably be more comfortable in doing so. I mean, for me, I'm glad I did this. It seemed like a really fun challenge, and I think that's my main reason for doing it. I just wanted to see if I could do it, you know? And it's cool seeing it all come together. I mean, turning a not-so-great thing into something really cool and fun. And my buddies really dig it, but at the same time, they probably wouldn't want something like this taking up space in their homes. But then again, they're not into retro gaming as much as I am. And this mod is somewhat future-proof if you think about it, because the Raspberry Pi is always getting newer models as the years go by, and essentially all you're going to need to do is just replace the Pi in your cabinet to the latest and greatest model. And I plan on doing that in the near future because this model of Raspberry Pi just isn't beefy enough to play Golden Axe: The Revenge of Death Adder, which is another arcade exclusive that I've been very much wanting to get into. Frustratingly, it will play, but the slowdown is just god-awful, and there's not much I can do about that with my hardware limitations that I've got here. Well, I hope this video really helped you out, and all in all, this was a pretty super fun mod to do, and I'd like to thank ETAPrime for his concise tutorial on the mod, as well as all of his other tutorials on things like the Raspberry Pi and pretty much anything else tech that you can think of. His videos are very helpful, and if you're considering this mod, definitely check out his video. You'll find that in the link of the description below.